This is Ted Cooley again on the discussion of chapters 5 and 6 of the People's History of the United States. We have 4 items on the chart here. 1, white man. 2, black women, both born slaves, and a women's convention, which will be covered, among other things, in these 2 chapters, beginning with chapter 5. The American Revolution was far more of a revolution than is usually taught in the schools. Zinn emphasizes the general uneasiness of his underclass during the years of fighting and negotiation involved in establishing a new form of government. Over and around this were larger social upsets, which involved a very large number of people in the colonies. The estimate that 1/3 of the colonists supported the revolution, 1/3 were for the king, and 1/3 were relatively indifferent is popular and possibly rather close to the truth. Many who supported the king left during or shortly after the end of hostilities. The son of Benjamin Franklin sailed with the British and spent the rest of his life in England. He and many other officials of the colonial administration returned to the home country. The redistribution of land mentioned by Zinn included a lot of land under control by the elite in the colonies. Some of the Scottish loyalists went to Nova Scotia, as that settlement had been established in 1773. The British government made a large land settlement in Canada north of Lake Erie, available to loyalists who had been displaced by the Revolution. My wife, Eleanor, has ancestors who went to Canada under these loyalist land grants in the 1780s and did not return to the United States until after the Civil War. Thus, a lot of land was now available for sharing with those who supported the revolution. Certainly, the well-off took their share, but a lot of small farmers and tenant farmers increased or acquired new holdings from the departure of those fleeing the new country. Shays' Rebellion and the 1792 Whiskey Rebellion certainly stressed the new system, though George Washington began the true exercise of presidential power dealing with the latter. Speaking of George Washington, unlike what the book says, he did not start out with a high level of wealth. Rather, he married a very, very rich widow. His own attitude, for instance, about slavery was somewhat ambivalent, though Martha was a very, very determined slaveholder, willing to leave no stone unturned in recovering those who ran from her ownership. The lack of solid cash in the colonies was a problem for the poor. Much of the hard cash was Spanish, as the Spanish government had helped finance the revolution, though it was the French who had the formal alliance. As the Spanish real, gold coin, was divided into 8 parts, pieces of 8 in the pirate sagas. This is the source of our quarter, or 2 bits, meaning 2 parts of the standard Spanish coin. Even with Hamilton's development of the decimal system, we still use some of the Spanish terminology, as in a quarter, as part of our currency. This multicultural experience increased during the time of the Articles of Confederation. With the formal British system out, trade increased, and so did the profits. The percentage of free blacks in the northern colonies increased, as did the occasional mention of military service of individuals of mixed heritage. The amount of interracial sex certainly seems to have increased, though documentation is often missing. Two of Thomas Jefferson's daughters by Sally Hemings were so fair that they moved to Washington, passed as white, and they and their descendants, if any, disappear from the Jefferson family line. The process of passing over is also an American tradition, with a now deceased aunt of mine by marriage and her brother doing so in the 1930s. The acquisition of wealth also had a varied past. Zinn credits George Washington with large land holdings. In fact, most of these were either from Martha or holdings in the Ohio country, which would have produced an argument as to the ownership, with the natives still inhabiting the land. The Cincinnati Company of officers in the Continental Army, which formed after the war, sought to claim a lot of the Ohio country. This turned out to be somewhat of an overreach, and most of those claims were finally denied. The settlement of Kentucky, however, blossomed in this period. Daniel Boone opened up a new home for many, mostly Scotch and Scotch-Irish, on the frontier. I have a great-great-grandmother born in 1803 in Kentucky, who listed in the 1880 census both of her parents having been born in Kentucky. When they got there and from where, I have not established, have no idea. But from the near the end of the Revolutionary War, this migration was well underway. Another entry in the becoming mixed of the United States were those in the British Army who stayed. 4 of those who surrendered at Yorktown had been established to be in my mother's family line. Some of the German mercenaries would have been welcomed in rural Pennsylvania among the rather large German-speaking community already established there. The foot soldiers in the Continental Army were given land grants for their service. As most of this was to the west, this increased the westward shift of the population, again at the expense of the natives. One I know who served in both the New York and Pennsylvania militia moved on further west in Pennsylvania to establish his claim. Despite the mixture of poverty and the movement of peoples, there was, for many at this time, an optimism about the future. In the middle of the talk of freedom and independence, there were the slaves. Zinn does not dwell on them in any great extent in this chapter, but it would have been impossible for all the talk of freedom and a new nation to go unheard and unremarked within the Black community. Even in New York, which had the largest Black population in the North, the influx of new immigrants from Europe and the widening of land ownership for the farmers tempered the percent of the slave population. Other states, like New Hampshire, already had contacts to hide escaped slaves. This was where Martha Washington's domestic slave, Onley Judge, found refuge for the rest of her life, dying in the 1830s. The middle colonies remained somewhat similar percentage of slaves, with large plantations remaining in Maryland, though the western part of the state reflected more immigrants moving southwest through the mountains from Pennsylvania. The South, and particularly South Carolina and Georgia, continued to import significant slaves, as well as face the fact of the Black community outnumbering the white. With previous slave revolts, the message of freedom circulating even in the slave cabins, despite the effort to suppress this news, required that the level of fear in the white community could only increase. The decision of the British to make a Southern strategy of their last campaign against the revolutionaries probably contained the idea that the fears of the Southern slaveholders would lead them to side with the British. And to a certain extent, this was true. But the population dominance of the blacks was such that few felt they could leave their farms and plantations to join the British forces, as they had to be present to prevent a slave uprising. Already, the fact colloquial that the owners of the slaves had the tiger by the tail was impacting these colonies. In time, it would move north to Virginia, though North Carolina was ambivalent and late to join the concern. As the future opened to the west, the new states being settled by South Carolina and Georgia continued to live under this fear. In a way, the future was already set. Chapter 6. It seems strange that this, the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote, that the history of the development of women's rights in most of the United States should be offered from the time of the Revolutionary War, particularly here in New Mexico, where under Spanish law, most of these rights have always existed. Under Spanish law, the right to inherit, to sue and be sued, to hold property in a woman's own name, to conduct business without need to consult another person. All these and more have never been abridged. Donna Tulles, the richest woman in New Mexico in 1846, ran her gambling establishment, the best west of the Mississippi by all reports, held her own property, traded on the Santa Fe Trail, and granted her inheritance to those she chose, even though she had been married and separated in the past. In fact, she loaned General Kearny the cash to pay the troops when the pay wagon from Fort Leavenworth was delayed. None of these rights were given to women in the colonies or following the new government. As late as 1978, a widow in the congregation I served in Kansas had the very substantial farming operation given by her husband's death, one half to her and one half to her son. Literacy was far less for women and rights almost non-existent in 1780. In the upper class, some literacy existed. A push, even as far as voting, was requested by women at the writing of the Constitution, yet this was simply ignored. The push for change came from women from all walks of society, from the mill hands in the first spinning and weaving factories to the few women who followed a formal medical career. All met obstacles. Yet perseverance overcame item after item. One of the first items, hardly recognized at the time, were the hardworking farm wives who accompanied their husbands in the Revolutionary War. A few taking combat roles, others assisting in the camp maintenance, which usually went to contractors in the British Army. The intellectually curious from the time of Anne Hutchinson pushed the boundary. She was ousted from Massachusetts Bay for questioning the parish preacher. A daughter of Governor Winthrop and an ancestor of Eleanor's, migrated to the New Amsterdam colony as she could not take the tight controls issuing in the name of her father. With the expansion of the frontier to the west of the mountains, the responsibility of teaching the children fell increasingly to the mothers, who also sought to increase their knowledge given the new situation. Those remaining in the established states found work in the beginnings of industrialization, soon forming the beginnings of unions and strikes. Unintended consequences contributed to the North/South split in the development of women's rights. New England, from the first, connected education with responsible religion, so that the community teacher was socially second only to the minister in many communities. Though outspoken women like Anne Hutchinson were censured, the concept of literacy for women existed because of the insistence that every adult should be sufficiently educated to read the Bible. This emphasis on education continued in the Northwest Ordinance of 1785, requiring Section 16 in every township to be dedicated to funding the local schools. There was no sexual limitation on this law, so that the principle of education for the girls was established for the land north of the Ohio River. This form of land organization continued eventually to the West Coast. One study, Zen Sites, reports a doubling of literacy for women between 1780 and 1840. The New England emphasis on literacy tended to travel west with the pioneers into the new states. In general, the majority of the pioneers, being farmers, followed the same latitude in the migrations, as this led to similar climate and farming conditions. In the South, there was no public funded education until Reconstruction in the late 1860s, with the rich sending their children to England or hiring tutors, while both Black and white on the bottom of society remained often illiterate. This disparity remains to some extent even today. Until the Civil War, there was a strong connection between the women's rights and abolitionist movements. There was strong Quaker influence on both of these movements from the presence of the Quakers in the colonies. The abolition movement was not religiously confined to the Quakers, for Barton Stone, one of the founders of the Disciples, was himself reported as having been tarred and feathered for abolitionist activities. He was most active in this in Indiana and Illinois. The abolitionist movement grew in the North with social, economic, and religious roots. This was a passionate campaign which attracted a significant number of women. In sharing the goals of the movement, these women found strength together, which built towards an emergent feminist movement as early as the 1830s. With the growth of elementary schools in both the cities and on the frontier, the demand for teachers was no longer met by the traditional structure. Thus, more and more women became teachers. To quote Zen, as teachers, they read more, communicated more, and education itself became subversive of old ways of thinking. The combination of these factors led to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, where women's rights took center stage. The attending persons represented a very large cross-section of backgrounds. Many of the women had been active in the abolitionist movement. Others were rebelling against the domestic role of women in the home. By this time, a few women had become physicians or ordained clergy. Resentment on the limitations of social dress and rules in the home increased the desire of many women for change. A significant number of men also agreed and attended the Seneca Falls meeting. The only Black was Frederick Douglass. Some 300 women, as well as a few men, attended, with 68 women and 32 men signing the final Declaration of Principles. At a following convention in 1851, Sojourner Truth spoke of her life as a slave woman with great courage. The fairly large presence of Black women in the movement is being recalled in this 100th anniversary of voting rights. Many of the early leaders were Quakers, as their system of worship was far more open to women speaking and leading, which gave experience in standing up for their ideas and rights. Though most of these leaders came from the middle class or higher, the logical need for change was apparent to many who did not take part. All women, as an oppressed group, were welcome to share in this awakening of the need for change in roles. End of chapter 6. Thank you for your attention.